It's been a decade. 10 long years since Daniel last stood at his mother's grave. The pain of losing her still stung, like it happened yesterday. But life had moved on. Time, as they say, doesn't stop for anyone. No matter how deep the wounds, still, there was something about today that felt different. Almost like the air around him was heavier. The clouds hung low in the sky, casting shadows across the cemetery. As he walked slowly towards her resting place, his heart was heavy, each step echoing the weight of all the memories he had buried over the years. Today was the day he would return, the day he would finally say goodbye again. For 10 years, Daniel had pushed the grief down, convinced himself he was fine, that he could live without her. But today, on the anniversary of her death, he couldn't ignore it any longer. The ache, the hole she left in his life, it was still there. He remembered everything. The smell of her perfume, the sound of her laughter, her gentle voice telling him everything would be okay. Even now, he could almost hear her saying those words in his mind. But she was gone. And that fact had never been harder to face. As Daniel stood in front of her grave, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves around him. He felt the coolness of it against his skin, a contrast to the warmth in his chest. As memories flooded back, he closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to just be there, in that space, with her in some way. "I miss you, Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But it felt like she could hear it. Maybe she could, maybe not, but he needed to say it. The cemetery was eerily quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of branches. No one else was around, which wasn't unusual. People rarely visited on days like this. Too painful, too much to bear. But for Daniel, this moment was something he had put off for far too long. He couldn't remember the last time he'd truly grieved for her. It was as though he had locked that part of himself away, never allowing himself to fully face the loss. Now, standing alone in the cemetery, he finally felt ready to confront it. The tears came, quietly at first, before building into something deeper. He knelt by the grave, his hand resting on the cold stone as he let the emotions flow. It wasn't the first time he had cried for her, but it felt different this time, like he was finally letting go. And yet, in the back of his mind, he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something was waiting. Just as he wiped his eyes and took a deep breath, ready to stand and leave, he felt it. The tap. It was light at first, like a gentle nudge on his shoulder. He froze, heart pounding in his chest. The cemetery was still. The air was thick with silence. And yet, there it was again. Another tap, this time firmer, as though someone were trying to get his attention. He turned quickly, spinning around to find nothing. No one was there. The graveyard was as empty as it had been before. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he stood still, scanning the area for any sign of movement. It had to be his imagination, or perhaps the wind. But no, this felt too real, too deliberate. His hand instinctively went to his shoulder, as if trying to confirm what he had just experienced. The tension in the air was palpable now, and Daniel's mind raced. Was it a memory playing tricks on him? Was it some part of his grief manifesting in a way he couldn't understand? Or could it be something else entirely? Something far beyond what he was prepared to comprehend. He took a hesitant step forward. Looking around once more, his senses heightened. The cold wind seemed to brush against him in a way it hadn't before. A shiver crawling down his spine. His heart was beating faster now, his breath shallow. What was happening? Just as he thought about turning to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He jumped, startled by the sudden noise. He pulled it out, expecting a message or a call. But what he saw on the screen made his stomach drop. It was a picture of his mother, a photo he had never seen before. The image was of her, smiling, standing next to the same gravestone where Daniel had just been kneeling. But what was most unsettling about the photo wasn't the fact that it was taken at her grave, but the time, stamp. The date on the photo was today. As he stared at the image, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His thumb hovered over the screen, uncertain of what to do next. Had someone taken this picture? If so, who? And more importantly, how was it possible? The eerie feeling deepened. The taps on his shoulder, the strange photo, and now this. What was going on? Could it be that his mother was trying to reach out to him? But how? And why now, after all these years? He couldn't make sense of it. His mind was spinning, unable to process the inexplicable events unfolding before him. He slowly looked around the cemetery once more, feeling as though he was being watched. But there was no one in sight. No living soul in the area, except for him. In that moment, Daniel knew that whatever was happening was no coincidence. Something had changed. Something had shifted. He had returned to this place seeking closure. But now he wasn't so sure he was ready to find the answers. The questions kept piling up, and with each passing second, the feeling of unease grew stronger. What was it that was reaching out to him? And was he prepared to face whatever came next? He couldn't tell, but one thing was certain. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Daniel's hands were shaking as he held the phone, staring at the photo in disbelief. How was it possible? He had spent years trying to move on from his mother's death, burying the rawness of his grief under layers of normal life. But now, standing in the very cemetery where she was buried, everything that he had tried to forget came rushing back. The photo on his screen had been taken only minutes ago. The timestamp clearly read today, right now. But that was impossible. His mom had died 10 years ago. There was no way anyone could have snapped a picture at that exact moment. He looked around, searching for any sign of life. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke on him. But the cemetery was still, silent, empty. His chest tightened as his thoughts spiraled. Was it his grief? Was his mind playing tricks on him, conjuring up things that weren't really there? The feeling of that tap on his shoulder, the photo, the uncanny sense of being watched. It all felt too real, and it left him terrified. A fear he hadn't felt since he was a child, hiding under the covers during thunderstorms. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Get it together," he muttered under his breath. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. His instincts told him that whatever was happening wasn't just a product of his imagination. It was something more. He walked away from his mother's grave, still staring at the photo. His legs felt heavy, like he was walking through a fog. Every step felt like it took twice as much effort as the last. He had to get out of here. He needed to go home, to think, to make sense of it all. But before he could leave the cemetery, a movement caught his eye. A shadow. It flickered at the edge of his vision, vanishing just as quickly as it appeared. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He turned his head sharply, his eyes scanning the surroundings. But there was nothing. Not a single person in sight. Was he losing his mind? Or was something really out there? Suddenly his phone buzzed again. He checked it immediately. A message this time, from an unknown number. "Don't leave yet." It was short, cryptic, and deeply unsettling. Daniel's blood ran cold. Who was this? How did they know he was here? His finger hovered over the screen, debating whether to reply. But before he could, another message came through. "Look closer," He squinted at the photo once more, trying to see something he might have missed, and then it hit him. The figure in the background. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but there, just beyond his mother's headstone, a shadow, a figure that shouldn't have been there. The more he looked, the clearer it became. It was almost as if someone was standing behind her, just out of focus, their face hidden. Daniel's stomach churned. Who was that? Why hadn't he noticed before? The unsettling feeling from earlier returned with full force, and his heart raced. He was no longer just grieving. He was now caught in something far darker, something he couldn't understand. His phone buzzed again, bringing him back to reality. It's not over. Not yet. This time, Daniel didn't hesitate. He quickly typed a response, his hands shaking as he pressed send. Who is this? What do you want? He waited. The silence was deafening. And then, after what felt like an eternity, a reply appeared. You'll find out soon enough. Daniel's thoughts were racing. His mind was in turmoil. But one thing became clear. This wasn't just a random prank. Whoever was behind this knew more than they should. They knew things only he and his mother could have known. The photo, the messages, the tap on his shoulder. Everything felt connected. But to what end? As he stood there in the quiet cemetery, trying to make sense of it all, he heard it again. A tap. This time it was louder, more forceful, like someone was tapping on his shoulder with purpose. His head whipped around, but once again, there was no one there. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. He backed away, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. It felt as though something invisible was holding him in place, freezing him, trapping him in this nightmare. Then, the ground beneath his feet shifted. Daniel stumbled, losing his balance as the earth seemed to rise and fall in strange, unnatural waves. His heart slammed against his ribs as panic began to set in. Whoever or whatever was here wasn't his mother. And if this was some kind of haunting, he wasn't prepared for what was coming next. A soft rustling of leaves interrupted his thoughts, and then, without warning, the figure began to move toward him. Daniel didn't wait to see who or what it was. He ran, his feet pounding against the gravel, the world around him blurring into a panic-filled haze. But as he ran, he felt the coldness creeping up behind him, the feeling of something, or someone, just inches away. And he knew that no matter how fast he ran, there was no escaping what was coming. He wasn't alone, and the graveyard had more to reveal than he was ready to face. Daniel's heart pounded as his feet slammed against the cemetery gravel, each step carrying him further away from the figure that was creeping closer with every passing second. The air felt thicker. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. And for the first time in his life, Daniel truly felt as though something beyond his understanding was closing in on him. He darted between the gravestones, his breath ragged and uneven, but no matter how fast he ran, he could feel the chill, like icy fingers brushing against his skin, inching closer. He didn't dare look behind him, knowing that if he did, he might not be able to keep moving. His mind raced. What was this thing? What did it want from him? The cemetery stretched endlessly before him, the rows of graves growing eerily uniform, as though they were all closing in, trapping him. Panic surged in his chest, and his legs began to feel like lead, heavy with the weight of fear. He stumbled, falling to his knees on the cold, hard ground, gasping for air. His head spun as he looked around, unable to make sense of what was real and what was just his racing mind. Daniel! The voice again. It was faint, distant, yet it felt like it was right next to him. He couldn't escape it. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. It was unmistakably his mother's voice, and yet it sounded off, distorted, like an echo coming from deep within a dark tunnel. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket again. He pulled it out without thinking, his hand trembling. The screen illuminated in the darkness, and there it was. A message from the unknown number. "Don't run. You'll never leave." The words sent a chill down his spine. He could feel the darkness around him closing in, the weight of unseen eyes watching him. But just as fear began to take over completely, something strange happened. A sudden calm washed over him. Daniel froze. For the first time, he allowed himself to look around. Everything went still. The voice, the shadows, the cold, it all stopped. He was no longer running, no longer fleeing from the unknown. His instincts told him to turn around, to face whatever was waiting behind him. So he did. What he saw stopped his heart cold. Standing before him, only a few feet away, was his mother, but not in the way he had imagined. She wasn't the vibrant woman from his memories. Instead, her image was ghostly, faint, like a reflection in foggy glass. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, were now hollow and empty. There was a sadness there, a heaviness that he couldn't quite place. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with both fear and disbelief. The figure nodded, her lips parting as if to speak. But instead of words, the air around her seemed to crackle with energy, vibrating in a way that Daniel couldn't understand. The world seemed to shift, like the very ground beneath him was alive, pulsing with an energy that was ancient and unsettling. "I'm sorry." The voice came again, but this time it was clearer. It wasn't his mother's voice, but a deeper, more resonant sound that echoed in his mind. "You were never meant to be a part of this." Daniel's pulse quickened. What was happening? What was his mother trying to tell him? The figure before him faded, the image distorting as if it were being erased. But just before she vanished entirely, a single phrase rang in his ears. "It's not over." The air snapped back to normal, the unsettling energy fading. Daniel was left standing alone in the graveyard, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The weight in the air lifted, but the tension didn't disappear. Instead, it lingered, an unspoken truth hanging in the silence, the feeling that something, some force, was watching, waiting. Daniel's mind raced, trying to comprehend everything he had just experienced. What had just happened? Was his mother's spirit truly trying to reach out to him? Or was something else at play? Something far darker and far older than he could possibly imagine. He looked down at his phone, his heart still racing. The screen had gone dark, but as his finger hovered over it, a new message popped up. "Don't forget who you are." The words were chilling in their simplicity, and Daniel realized, with a shudder, that this wasn't just about his mother. It wasn't even just about the grief and loss he had buried for so long. This was something much bigger, something that reached far beyond him, beyond his family, and into something ancient, something that had been waiting for him to return to this place. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The night was silent once more. The only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Daniel stood there, frozen in place, as he processed everything that had just occurred. His mother's grave, the strange figure, the haunting voice. All of it was tied together. But how? Why? One thing was clear. He wasn't alone. The past, the memories, the spirits, everything was still here. tangled together in a way he couldn't understand. But as the night deepened and the reality of what had just happened set in, Daniel realized he was never truly going to leave. Not really, because in that moment, the graveyard whispered a truth he hadn't wanted to hear. He was part of this, and now there was no going back. With a final glance at his mother's grave, Daniel turned and walked away, his footsteps slow and measured, the weight of everything still pressing down on him. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. The story wasn't over, and neither was he. The graveyard would always remember, and so would he.